Hello, and welcome to our Week 2 supplemental lecture on Isaiah Berlin's The Counter-Enlightenment. Our primary podcasts for this week, as well as most of the readings that are available to you this week, talk about what the Enlightenment is, or they are examples of current-day critical engagements with the concept of enlightenment, often people trying to figure out how we can pick up, adapt, or retain some concept of enlightenment, even while critically recognizing some of the difficulties of this concept as it originally arose. Berlin's article is an opportunity to take a look at the opposition to the Enlightenment, not just in the current day, but back at the origins of the Enlightenment itself. He'll break down various criticisms of the Enlightenment in this piece, and he'll trace some of their political implications forward in time and connect them up with contemporary movements. Now, this is a piece that drops a lot of names. He mentions a lot of historical figures. If you know a bit of history, that may be useful to you and help you conceptualize and understand what he's talking about. If you're not familiar with them, the text can be a little bit intimidating. What I'm going to do here is try to minimize the discussion of particular figures and just break down a schematic of his argument to help you get the gist of what he's saying, even if the names are unfamiliar to you. And then you might be able to go back and see if you want to look up who some of the people are, if they are unfamiliar. Okay, so to talk about the opposition to the Enlightenment, he first has to give a sense of what he means by the Enlightenment, what is being opposed. And he says the Enlightenment is the proclamation of the autonomy of reason and the methods of the natural sciences based on observation as the sole reliable method of knowledge, again thinking back to Bacon from our lecture this week, and the consequent rejection of the authority of revelation, sacred writings and their accepted interpreters, tradition, prescription, and every form of non-rational and transcendent source of knowledge. Okay? So he has in mind the knowledge founded on the experimental method, on a solid method of observation that we're going to share in common. And it's pointed, he won't say so in this spot, but he'll get into it in a few minutes, to the universal. The Enlightenment is seeking universals. So there's opposition immediately. It's not that opposition develops over time, it's that at the very time and at the same moment that the Enlightenment is forming, you get various kinds of opposition. And some of those sorts of opposition are quite predictable, and he's not going to really talk about those in this article. So he says you can expect that churches and religious authorities are going to oppose this, because he's directly critical of churches and religious authorities. He says there's also a quite long-standing relativist and skeptical tradition that actually dates back to classical antiquity, and it contests whether there are universals of human nature or society. Okay, and it can bolster the arguments of the ancients with new evidence from world exploration. But he says the relativists and the skeptics still are basically on side with the Enlightenment. They're not deep critics. The real critics of the Enlightenment, the ones that are the most troubling to the Enlightenment tradition, are people who reject the concept of universal laws at all. So he says, thinkers might differ about what these laws were or how to discover them or who were qualified to expound them. That these laws were real and could be known, whether with certainty or only probability, remained the central dogma of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is committed to the idea of universal laws, and you can bicker around the fringes, and you can debate exactly what the laws are and how certain we can be above them, but this is the central dogma of the Enlightenment for Berlin. It was the attack upon this that constitutes the most formidable reaction against this dominant body of belief. Okay, so he's going to go through and look at and unpack what's going on with thinkers who reject universal laws. And he starts off with Vico, and I'm going to go ahead and mention this name because it is a name that will come up in your readings later in the term, and Vico is often given this status. He rejects the notion that mathematics is the highest science. This is a thing that's commonly asserted at the period that he's writing, and it's understood as the highest science because it seems to be very, very certain and very precise and very replicable. And Vico says, sure, but it only has these qualities because it's a completely human creation. Whether mathematics is a human creation, whether it corresponds to something in the real world, in the universe, that we have read out of the universe, is actually something that is still a contemporary subject of debate in the philosophy of science. But Vico says mathematics doesn't correspond to anything objective, not to anything that's really out there. You can use it for some purposes, you can plot patterns in what happens, but that's not very interesting, Vico thinks. You can't understand how or why the patterns occur. So for him, mathematics is a very subordinate form of knowing. It might be able to show us some things, but he thinks that another form of knowing should actually be the highest science. He also doesn't think that our highest knowledge is going to be of nature, or that we can have secure and reliable knowledge of nature. And why is that? It's because only God is going to be able to know nature, because God is the one who made nature. Nature is a product of God, not a product of us. We are always outside nature, looking on, and will never completely understand it. What we can know is something that we do create, and that's human history. So the study of history for Vico has a higher status than the study of mathematics, or the study of physics, or the study of biology. This is a human creation, and therefore it can be thoroughly known by humans. He denies the existence of timeless natural laws that could have been known to anyone, anywhere. Okay, and we'll pick this up again when we look at theories of the sciences, and particularly at Kuhn, and the notion of whether our forms of science are the realization or culmination of things that other societies have been trying to do but they've just not done as well, or whether there's something fundamentally different going on in different societies. They're not even trying to do the same thing and wouldn't appreciate the insights of other times and places in the same way. So he says timeless natural laws that could have been known to anyone anywhere don't exist. Cultures are unique, and they're characterized by a kind of pervasive style that distinguishes them from all others. Okay, and this is a founding insight for a variety of different disciplines, for linguistics, for history, for anthropology, for human sciences. He draws a very sharp distinction between what we now think of as the hard sciences, which study relatively stable nature, but for him do it from the outside, versus the humanities that study human society from within using empathy. We can have empathic insight into human societies, including societies other than our own, because history is a human product. Berlin says, if his view was correct, it was subversive of the very notion of absolute truths and of a perfect society founded on them, not merely in practice, but in principle. So there is an Enlightenment drive to perfect society. Perfecting society only makes sense if certain universals are true of society, is Berlin's suggestion here, and Vico contests that this is possible. Then Berlin goes through a series of other attacks on rationalism that sort of begin to flow out from this point, and he goes through a variety of different names. I'm just going to focus on the positions here rather than on the historical figures. You can go back to the article and look up the details. But Berlin's going to focus on figures who accuse rationalism and scientism of distorting reality, and these are critiques that you can still hear today. So Berlin says these are figures who think the seamless whole of reality in its unanalyzable flow is misrepresented by static spatial metaphors of mathematics and the natural sciences. To dissect is to murder. This is a romantic pronouncement that is the motto of an entire 19th century movement. Life is action. Before a man has liberated himself from the deathly embrace of impersonal scientific thought, which robs all it touches of life and individuality, he cannot understand himself or others, or how or why we come to be what we are. Okay? These are kinds of things that people will still say about the sciences. There's something lifeless, there's something external, there's something deathly about reducing lived experience to numbers and equations and schematics and analyses that generalize from lived experience. There is a strain of critical thought that says this about science, and there is a pushback against it that says there are things you will never, ever, ever see if you're just focusing at the level of individual lived experience. There are kinds of realities that are only visible mathematically or statistically or through some kind of scientific abstraction. We'll look at these views a little bit more closely later in the term. The attacks on rationalism tend to emphasize the importance of language, and language as a cultural product, and distinctive languages supporting the idea of the distinctiveness of the cultures that they're associated with. There's also a focus on the centrality of individual character and the individuality and organic cohesiveness of each society, as those societies are sort of relatively bounded, coherent wholes. Berlin suggests that some of these strands have intimations of nationalist movements that are going to emerge later in history, and already contain some of the opposition to cosmopolitanism and universalism that erupts in nationalism. We're going to take a look at nationalist movements when we talk about political systems and political institutions in a few weeks, and we'll also talk about cosmopolitanism. This is a tension that is still current. There's also an interesting opposition to a notion that different nations are on the same developmental continuum. Okay, so if there aren't universal laws of development, it doesn't make sense to say that nations are more or less fully realized versions of a particular image of modernity. And we'll talk about developmental theories also in later weeks. Now, Berlin says that there's not one political impulse that you can associate with these kinds of critiques of the Enlightenment. There are conservative and radical versions. There are liberal and reactionary versions. It's politically a mixed bag. Okay, so he talks about Burke, whom we'll read a little bit of next week, and he groups him with a set of other, he calls him romantic, vitalist, intuitionist, and irrationalist writers, both conservative and socialist, who defend the value of organic forms of life. So there's the notion that you've got various sorts of universals that are homogenizing. You've got capitalism, you've got technologies, you've got spreads of forms of government that are attacking organic traditional forms of life, and you can get conservative and socialist defenses of those organic forms. And Berlin identifies a number of 18th century impulses that lead into what he regards as later conservative and reactionary movements. And he pinpoints specifically non-rationalist factors, so the emphasis on the importance of the non-rational. A stress on the value of the individual, the peculiar, the impalpable. Okay, so you don't want universals, you want particulars, you don't want things that can be rationally analyzed and pinned down, you want something that's kind of ineffable, that's resistant to that kind of analysis. And then, most ominously for Berlin, appeals to ancient historical roots and immemorial custom uncorrupted by the sophistries of subtle reasoners. And again, what he's fearful of is fascism and reactionary forms of nationalism here. So he sees in this particular kind of anti-Enlightenment critique the sort of echoes of what will become quite oppressive political movements in the 20th century. But he says, curiously, Kant, who's not at all a romantic figure, ends up giving a big impetus to these sorts of romantic critiques of the Enlightenment. And he does it because of his reflections on what it means to be a moral agent. So, to be a moral agent, you have to step outside the realm of causal determination for Kant. So, there's an anti-deterministic impulse here in order to salvage the notion that it is meaningful to say that we're moral agents. So Berlin says, Kant initiated a cult of moral autonomy, according to which only those who act and are not acted upon, whose actions spring from a decision of the moral will to be guided by freely adopted principles, and not from the inescapable causal pressure of factors beyond their control, can properly be considered free, or indeed moral agents at all. Okay, So Kant, although an Enlightenment figure, licenses a particular reaction to deterministic conceptions of science, and also valorizes the individual as someone who autonomously exercises their own will. And the emphasis on will is going to become quite important to particular kinds of anti-Enlightenment movements who will pick up that concept and do quite different things with it than what Kant does. So developing the issue of Romanticism and the issue of will, Berlin talks about the decision to use a concept of will against nature, the notion that we're fighting against and throwing ourselves at a meaningless nature. He says, human nature is no longer conceived of as in principle capable of being brought into harmony with the natural world. So there is a notion in the Enlightenment, and we saw this a bit in Kant, and that was discussed in the lecture relating to his What is Enlightenment text. There is the notion that reason freely exercised will understand its place, will understand its harmony with natural law, will form harmonious social relations. The Romantic movement for Berlin breaks with that. There's no particular reason to assume that human nature in any particular time and place is going to be able to be brought into harmonious relationship with nature or with particular social institutions. It expresses a faith in an intuitive faculty that is distinct from the Enlightenment focus on analytic intellect. And Berlin talks about anti-positivist and anti-rationalist movements. We'll talk about positivism and anti-positivism. These are debates that play out heavily in the social sciences when we are looking at science and its critics in a few weeks' time. And there's a privileging of art and individual self-expression as a sort of quintessential practice. So not collective scientific practice oriented to universals or consensus about what's the case in the natural world, but artistic, individual, creative self-expression. And a denial of the Enlightenment notion that you can find some certain endpoints in nature, that nature is going to give you your values or your ideals or your laws when human custom can't do that anymore. Berlin says that by contrast, Romantic movements see creation as the creation of ends as well as means, values as well as their embodiments. The vision that I seek to translate into colors and sounds is generated by me, peculiar to me, unlike anything that has ever been or will be, above all not something that is common to me and other men seeking to realize a common, shared, universal because rational ideal. Okay, so it is a rejection of this commonality and the assertion of a strong particularity that is understood to be creative. Berlin says there's a dark side to this creative self. He says, first of all, it's not always identified with the personal self. It's not just this sort of creative, individual artist. It can be a transcendent entity or organism, and Berlin finds some very dark possibilities in the creative self when it is understood as this kind of transcendent entity. He says aggressive nationalism, self-identification with the interests of the class, the culture, or the race, or the forces of progress, with the wave of a future-directed dynamism of history, something that at once explains and justifies acts which might be abhorred or despised if committed from calculation of selfish advantage or some other mundane motive. This family of political and moral conceptions is so many expressions of a doctrine of self-realization based on defiant rejection of the central theses of the Enlightenment, according to which what is true or right or good or beautiful can be shown to be valid for all men by the correct application of objective methods of discovery and interpretation open to anyone to verify. So again, this conception of the Enlightenment that we saw in our common lecture this week on science and its foundational texts, the idea that if we look at the same objects and we apply the same methods, we'll come up with a common result, that's rejected. And it's rejected in ways that focus on a creativity that is not always an individual creativity, but can be the creativity of a whole nation, of a people, of a movement, and the people bound up in that creative entity can rationalize forms of behavior that are abhorrent, that they could not rationalize as individuals because they believe they're caught up in a higher cause. Berlin says, in its full romantic guise, this attitude is an open declaration of war upon the very heart of the rational experimental method. He talks about conceptualizing the universe as the world spirit. So scientific inquiry takes nature, takes the universe as an object that is external to us, that we can examine with the proper methods, and we can come up with shared conclusions. More romantic movements may take the universe not as a structure that can be studied or described by whatever methods are most appropriate, but as a perpetual activity of the spirit and of nature, which is that self-same spirit in dormant state. Okay, so the universe is not a passive object that's out there somewhere. It is an active entity that is creative and in motion, and what we think of in nature is just spirit dormant. Okay, it might be acting like an object, but it is not just a dead object there for us to examine. Genius is the conscious agent of this spirit. Okay, and in some variants of this, Berlin says there's a notion that there is a progressive movement, that the world spirit is self-perfecting, that it is moving forward over time. And so you can get a positive notion of progress even from within this romantic space that tries to be a different understanding of progress from the Enlightenment one. But you also get movements within this space that see the movement of the world spirit as a meaningless process without a goal. And so you can get quite disruptive, you can get movements that are trying to argue that there is a process that goes blindly forward, pulling everyone in its wake, and that it is a fundamentally kind of negative image of what kind of process is unfolding. Okay, so it's progress as catastrophe, or as the piling up of meaninglessness. And if that's your conception, you may think that science is an activity that we engage in to try to reassure ourselves that we still have some measure of control when we've realized the world is fundamentally beyond control and fundamentally without meaning. And if you think back to the Nietzsche passage that we looked at in the Common lecture this week, that's sort of hitting on this kind of sensibility. And again, Berlin says there is political diversity in the opposition to Enlightenment. It's not the case that it is entirely right-wing or entirely left-wing or entirely revolutionary or reactionary. But what the forms share in common, regardless of their political valence, is that the organization of life, by the application of rational or scientific methods, or any form of regimentation or conscription of men for utilitarian ends or organized happiness, is rejected. No regimented, organized attempt to keep people happy in some sort of pacified state. And then he ends on this figure de Maistre, who he talks about as one of the darkest of the reactionary forms of the fight against the Enlightenment. And what bothers him here is the Enlightenment, Berlin says, has a basic belief that there is no original sin. Okay, it's one of the things the Enlightenment rejects from the church. Original sin having the idea that there's something corrupted about humanity from the beginning. The Enlightenment thinkers don't think this. They either think that there's something benevolent and positive about humans that gets distorted by society, so if you had the right kind of society, that distortion would go away, or at the very least they think that if you engineer your social institutions correctly, you can get positive things from humanity. Berlin is worried here about a kind of critique of the Enlightenment that rejects that premise, that rejects the image of humanity as naturally benevolent. Okay, for Maistre, nature is a field of unceasing slaughter. Men are by nature aggressive and destructive. When the destructive instinct is evoked, men feel exalted and fulfilled. They are never so united as when given a common altar upon which to immolate themselves. Okay, so it's a dark vision of humanity that glorifies war, or at least understands war as a natural expression of natural human impulses, and is opposed to the attempt to found society on reason because it thinks that reason is too weak. If you give reasons for things, that invites people to come back and criticize those reasons, and then if they can tear them apart, it will tear down the hierarchies and the oppressive structures that you need in order to keep these violent impulses in check. Reason is too weak to contain these destructive impulses. Berlin is worried about these critiques. He believes that they have spilled out into nationalism, into fascism, into totalitarianism of various forms. And he's trying to understand the critiques of the Enlightenment and the weaknesses of the Enlightenment itself that make it vulnerable to some of these critiques, in an attempt to work out how we can have an appropriation of the Enlightenment and a recognition of forms of critiques of the Enlightenment that are going to take us to dangerous places politically. And some of the heat and some of the temper that we're going to run into when we revisit these topics, talking about science and its critics, relates to people who have the same worries that Berlin does. There is a worry that certain kinds of critiques of science are attempting to open a pathway through which fascism and totalitarianism are perceived to have come into history in an earlier period.